Welcome. We're going to talk about Chapter 7 from OpenStax, Cellular Respiration. Today we're going to explore why we breathe. And we're really going to look into the mighty mitochondria today and breathing. So let's get started. We are going to break this lecture up into several different parts, so you'll see it in multiple mini videos, so you can watch just little chunks of it and not a huge long video, and rewatch every little part if you want. All right. So our learning objectives, we're going to have you explain the role of cellular respiration for those living things that use it, differentiate between breathing from cellular respiration, describe the reactions and outcomes of each stage of cellular respiration, and compare and contrast cell respiration to fermentation. So that's our objectives for this. Before we start, I want you to remember what we went over last time about metabolism, and that plays a lot into respiration and what we're going to be talking about energy. Remember, metabolism comes in two different parts in the creation and breaking down of molecules. A macromolecule that is broken down is catabolism, which is the breaking down of macromolecules into simpler molecules that releases energy, and that is very important to what we're talking about today. So catabolism, breaking down of molecules, and anabolism, where we take simpler molecules and use energy to build up those molecules to make a macromolecule, where energy is needed to make something that is also needed in what we're talking about today. And ATP, very important to cellular respiration. Remember, ATP is that central portion of energy. We need ATP to produce energy, and we find ATP, we find our energy in between the second and third phosphate when the bond is broken and hydrolyzed. That is where the energy is produced. So energy from catabolism is released and then used. The energy from anabolism is used for transport and movement. We can also input energy into the system and build up that molecule to make ATP, and then we can break it down and release energy out of the system and use it for transport and movement. We also can put energy into the system to build up ATP and use it for later. Very important for today's talk as well. Today we're going to talk all about energy. Where does all this energy come from? Where does that ATP come from? If you have thought about it, hopefully, energy comes from food, right? You feel less energized when you haven't eaten. You feel a lot crankier, and you get a lot more energy when you eat food. So that is where our energy comes from. On a molecular level, it actually comes from catabolism. Energy is released from the food we eat. Energy is used to make ATP. We eat food. It is broken down into simpler molecules. Specifically, we take glucose, and that is broken down and made into ATP. So we break down carbohydrates for energy, specifically ATP energy. And that is what we're talking about today. So I want you to take a second and just breathe. So remember, we talked about how the opening slide was, why do we breathe? So take a minute, take a deep breath, and out. All of that oxygen that fills up your lungs. How is this involved in energy and eating and ATP? Where does all that oxygen go? Why do we need this oxygen? Why is it important? Why is oxygen important to our cells? Why do we breathe? Why are we taking in this oxygen day in and day out? Why do we breathe? Have you thought about this thought? Why do our cells need oxygen every second of every day? Why do we breathe? Think about that. Take in that oxygen, expel that carbon dioxide. Where is it all going? What is it doing in your cells? Why are we breathing? And how is energy involved in that? Have you thought about that? All right, so let's talk about it. So breathing is directly connected to cellular respiration. That's why it's called respiration, respiring, breathing. Are your cells breathing? Kind of. They kind of are. It's the gas exchange between blood and air. But on a simple level, what's happening is we take in oxygen through our lungs, and that oxygen then fills up our blood, and our blood circulates that oxygen throughout our body. It takes all of that oxygen to our cells, like muscle cells and all different types of cells, and we get cellular respiration. And it is the cellular respiration that is very important. That's where our cells are doing the work, creating energy. And once that oxygen goes in and cellular respiration happens, the CO2 then gets transported out. That's the exchange of gas. The CO2 goes then out through the bloodstream and back out through our lungs, and we breathe CO2 out into the environment. So that is how breathing is related to cellular respiration. But how is it related to all of this ATP and food and energy and all of these things that we're trying to connect together? Well, we're going to take that step by step. So this is what the grand scheme of things looks like. We take in a glucose molecule. You have seen it look like this. It is a 6-carbon ring, It looks like this, but it also can be represented like this, 6 carbons. And then we also take in oxygen. So we take in food, as in glucose. We take in oxygen through breathing. And then it goes in through our body. And then it gets transported to all of our cells. Namely, the big part of our cells, the mitochondria. And it gets converted to CO2, carbon dioxide, water, and most importantly, it gets converted to energy. And what is that energy that it gets converted to? What is the energy molecule we're looking for? Think about it. It is that ATP molecule that we're converting. It is that energy molecule. So this is what's happening. We eat, we breathe, and our cells convert things into oxygen, water, and energy. And it's beautiful. So the goal of cellular respiration is to get smaller carbon molecules and release energy through the breaking of bonds. So let's think about that. What does it mean to get smaller carbon molecules? Well, I start out with this glucose molecule, which is 6 carbons big, right? It is this 6 carbon ring. And the goal of cellular respiration is to break these bonds. We're going to break all these bonds in here that carbon has, and it stores energy in those bonds. And the energy is released here. So I'm going to break all the bonds and make single carbons. And the single carbons are released as CO2. So I was 6 carbons as glucose here. And I'm going to make single carbons as CO2. So I'm going to break some bonds, break it down. And in breaking those bonds, I'm going to make CO2 and most importantly, energy. And to do that, I need oxygen. And I also get some water out of it. So that's the goal. That is the goal of cellular respiration. Okay. So how do we do it? Well, we start with the mighty mitochondria. We need a powerhouse, right? I know all of you have heard it, right? The powerhouse of the cell. We need something to do it for us. We need the mitochondria. So the mitochondria holds most of the parts to do this. Actually, some of the parts are held in our own cytosol, and then most of the parts to do this are in the mitochondria. So we'll see where all this is happening, but we need the mitochondria to do this. Without the mitochondria, we cannot break all of this down. So one of the things you need to know is that the mitochondria has so many different parts. It has its own outer membrane, it has its own inner membrane, it has its own inner matrix, it has its own inner membrane space. That is very important. And that is where ATP is synthesized here in the inner membrane space. So lots of important places on the mitochondria. So there are several steps to cellular respiration and how we get from our big glucose 6 carbons to our 1 carbon CO2 using oxygen and releasing ATP. There are 4 main steps. There's glycolysis, which happens in the cytosol out here in the cell. There's pyruvate oxidation, which happens in the mitochondria. There's the citric acid cycle. Say that 5 times fast. Which also happens in the mitochondria here in the matrix. And then the electron transport chain, which happens in the inner membrane space of the mitochondria. So there's 4 main steps, and some of the steps release ATP. You can see the release of some ATP here. And some of the steps, which are not drawn here for some reason, it didn't show up. Some of these steps also we will talk about release some very important other molecules called electron carriers, which we are going to talk about. So 4 main steps, and what we really need to know is that we need to eat and we need to breathe to create energy and water. And we also need our mitochondria to help us out in our cells. So we're going to break this down by each step. We're going to go step by step, glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, citric acid cycle, and then electron transport chain. So come back to the next video and we will start with glycolysis.